It's not post-revolutionary. Thank you. Welcome to the round two, guys. My name is Jay John. I'm going to be the chair of this round. We have one trainee. Today is Constance. Without further ado, the movement in post-revolutionary society is not regrets. The portrayal of overthrown dictators is absolutely evil, but like what the Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, ladies and gentlemen, the goal of every post-revolutionary society is in terms of societal cohesion, reconstruction, and reintegration that is inclusive to all members of the society. The reality is that, in the vast majority of instances, overthrown dictators in post-revolutionary societies still get to keep their modicum of support. This is the same with Ferdinand Marcos of the Philippines and Hosni Mubarak of Egypt, for example. Thus, what we would say, coming from our side of the house, is that the state-sanctioned portrayal of overthrown dictators as absolutely evil is hugely ineffective for the state to carry. But first, a few clarifications from the Prime Minister. The first idea is that the affirmative bench still supports the accountability on the part of these dictators, ladies and gentlemen, such as giving them representation and holding trial to adjudicate their guilt, and if they are found guilty, we're willing to carry out punishment for them, ladies and gentlemen, as was the case with Charles Taylor. But a further clarification is a question of what does this portrayal as absolutely evil look like? It's not only, ladies and gentlemen, we see this in the forms of families of these dictators being banned from joining the political system, ladies and gentlemen, by the state instituting a lifetime ban on running in public office on the parts of these relatives. It also means the abject and deliberate denial of benefits brought about by these dictators during their term, ladies and gentlemen, such as the closing down of the Bataan nuclear power plant during the Marcos dictatorship, even if it yielded to a net general good, ladies and gentlemen, but it was closed down just because it has a Marcos mark in it. Lastly, it also means, among many other things, censorship of ideas that support these dictators and the criminalization of the supporters that still glorify this particular dictators in Israel. We think that these particular ideas are very clear and they are problematic. I want to provide two key ideas in my Prime Minister's speech. Firstly, an objective portrayal necessitates that the state deviate from moral absolutism, and secondly, the portrayal of absolute evil is an exclusionary narrative that prevents societal cohesion. Let's go to the first one. Why an objective portrayal, will thank you, that we're trying to forward on our side, necessitates that the state deviate from a moral absolutism, ladies and gentlemen, because we think that painting down these overthrow dictators as absolutely evil is a moral sanctioning coming from the state, ladies and gentlemen, and it is dangerous. On the first idea, we say that it creates a rhetorical ammunition that this is a politicized state with its own biases against that specific dictator, ladies and gentlemen. And this is problematic because it will be prone to attacks coming from the public, and it affirms that bias, that the bias exists coming from the state, ladies and gentlemen. And all the functions of the state that it does in order to question what this particular dictator is doing is reduced into a political propaganda, ladies and gentlemen, to scare off support from that particular narrative. Moreover, it means that the message that the state is trying to forward, that we must not let this atrocity happen again, gets lost in translation, ladies and gentlemen. That's how it hurts political discussions when you have a marking of a political propaganda thrown to the state, ladies and gentlemen. We saw this when the state is impotent against claims that the infrastructure that have been built during the Marcos era, like the National Lung Center or the National Kidney Institute, is like completely evil, ladies and gentlemen, and we have to close this down altogether. The people are asking why you have to close down these beneficial infrastructures. There is no response from the state. That's why it had the marking of political propaganda in it. That's why the people are not likely to accept that particular idea, ladies and gentlemen. Sure.
So can we ask how does your counter model look like? So for example, how do you justify like Nazi Germany or the Kerman rule as not absolutely evil?
I'm sorry, but this motion asks us to regret that particular portrayal, ladies and gentlemen. So what we're doing right now is we're trying to provide standards why that absolute portrayal of evil is regrettable, ladies and gentlemen. And we said it's it's regrettable because it's unstrategic for the state to engage in a political discourse when political propaganda can be called out against it, ladies and gentlemen. So let's go to the second idea, where the portrayal of overthrown dictators as absolutely evil is an exclusionary narrative that prevents societal cohesion, at the same time creates the scenario in which these particular dictators can reimagine themselves, or like even in their deaths, ladies and gentlemen, can still change the outcomes that the people, the narrative of the people will eventually look like, ladies and gentlemen. Let's go to the first idea. We say that it leads to an antagonism against a state, and the modicum of support that I talked about exists, ladies and gentlemen. It means that the state creates a stance that is inherently exclusive to this particular modicum of support. It leads to factionalization, ladies and gentlemen, such as what we saw in Yugoslavia and its narrative of ultranationalism, because every ruling party that came after an overthrown dictator wanted to have a monolithic narrative and a monolithic account of what that particular dictator looked like. So they just keep on forwarding a narrative that this particular person is bad, that's why you must not support it. It does not aim to engage the people who are supporting the dictator and why that support exists, ladies and gentlemen. Especially when the characterization of post-revolutionary society is one that is struggling fresh from violent revolutions because of these exchanges and the differences in opinions, ladies and gentlemen. State-sanctioned account of the absolute evil means that the state holds the authority that your belief is illegitimate and invalid, ladies and gentlemen. That's why the supporters for that particular dictators are hugely unengaged and uncorrected, because they hide from the state that particular belief or fear that they will be discriminated, but they still pass it on to their children or to their immediate community, ladies and gentlemen, and there is no way and there is minimal capacity for the state to correct that, because they are not aware of how that particular narrative is being forwarded and being mangled by this particular communities, ladies and gentlemen. That's why the immediate result of this particular state sanctioning of what is morally absolute and who is more absolutely evil, ladies and gentlemen, is the creation of a world where there is a division of the supporters and the state. We're extremely happy to host.
The speaker spoke for 7 minutes and 14 seconds. I thank the Prime Minister. Now we invite the Leader of Opposition.
Mr. Speaker, before we go into anything else, and there's quite a lot to go into, we'll talk about how villainization looks like, right? So how does this absolute evil villainization actually look like? We don't think it's just about the removal of infrastructure, right? We tell you that it is considering that a person, a dictator, was so morally reprehensible that even the benefits that have occurred during his time cannot be credited adequately to him, right? This means to say that we consider this particular individual to be extremely evil, right? How does this look like when operationalized? We tell you that we will run this national narrative, for example, in textbooks, right? We will tell our students this narrative. We will run it during state propaganda, whatever state media that we have access to, right? We will also, regarding infrastructure, infrastructure, right? We don't really think you have to remove the infrastructure. Like, you don't have to follow the Filipino model. What you can do is you can follow the Indian model, just continue changing names. That happens as well, right? And that works pretty well too, because historical erasure is a thing, right? Because the majority of people who support, like, the overthrow of a dictator happen to be exactly that. They happen to be a majority. But I'll go into why maintaining cohesion, because they were talking about an exclusionary narrative, right? But we're going to talk about why maintaining cohesion within the people who did win is so important for national unity in the first place, right? Now that we've talked about how that that vilification looks like, let's talk about why a post-revolutionary society finds it so necessary to have a strong, resonant narrative. Why, like, whatever truth and reconciliation committee lookalike that they have isn't going to be, like, adequate, right? Let's go into that. Now, how does this PRS, the post-revolutionary society, look like, right? Number one, because it doesn't have a strong national identity. Why? Oftentimes, dictators who have managed to entrench their power over decades have, like, a stronghold over state military power, as well as, like, the deep state within the country itself, right? This means that overthrowing them is incredibly difficult. The disparate groups that go into overthrowing them, while they consist of a numerical majority, oftentimes have no real strong ideological unity with each other. So I'm talking about, like, the Al-Nusra Front, the Muslim Brotherhood. These people don't actually have a very strong unity, right? Their unity was derived from opposing that particular dictator, right? Now, what happens in countries where you allow this narrative to disappear, right? The narrative that the dictator is absolutely evil to disappear. Then the people who end up winning end up suffering, because the disparate groups now no longer have a common enemy. Sit down, right? We tell you that this happened in Libya, which is why there is a complete dissolution of state currently, because, like, these people cannot find themselves agreeing upon anything, right? They can't actually agree upon a standard national narrative to which, that binds them. We tell you that the best national narrative that will bind them is one that the dictator was fucked up, because the people who believe in this are a numerical majority who otherwise don't really have a lot of common beliefs, right? Or have beliefs rather that are directly antagonistic to each other. We're talking about, for example, maybe moderate Muslims versus more hardline Muslims. The only belief that they have is that Muslim Mubarak was screwed up, right? We tell you that that's an important narrative to retain. A Truth and Reconciliation Committee doesn't retain that resonant narrative. That's why absolute vilification is important. Right? Now let's move on into why this narrative can't allow for any credence or legitimacy to be given to the dictator. So why can't we have a narrative where, for example, we say that the dictator did some good things, but then he also did some fucked up things, right? One wants to see he did fucked up things, an absolutely evil person, right? We tell you that this is important because a simple narrative is necessary in order to maintain this legitimacy. The very resonance that I was talking about, that doesn't happen when you have a complicated narrative with many, many moving parts. Right? It doesn't work well with people. It's not easy to memorize words too, right? But more importantly, like, we also tell you that it concedes an equal moral worth and legitimacy to the other side of the story. This means to say that the loyalist, or rather that particular dictator, was somehow legitimate or had some degree of legitimacy in the things that he did. This means that his narrative persists in the state, right? They told us, their response to this was that there will always be loyalists who may hide it from the state, but may secretly retain their identities, right, as loyalists, and then will pass it on to their children. We tell you that that is unlikely to happen for a number of reasons, right? The first one is that when we vilify a specific individual, we are specifically veering away from vilifying according to categorical grounds. For example, grounds of ethnicity, for example, because we say that the morally abhorrent way in which this particular person act was screwed up, right? If you support only that screwed up behavior, you're wrong, not because you are part of a specific ethnicity, etc., etc. Now, this means that when you have a post-revolutionary society that works along this narrative, it's easy to distance yourself from this dictator because it means that there's a better quality of life for your children, for example, right? Now, when there is that better quality of life, how does the beliefs of these children look like? We tell you that these children will go to school, and they will listen to this national narrative, and then they may go back home to parents who tell them maybe it wasn't that bad, but overwhelmingly they're treated with a better state, a state that gives them and provides them far better, and only asks that they keep their mouth shut and follow the national narrative instead, right? And we tell you that the benefit of all of this is that ultimately these people, even the children of these loyalists, ultimately still believe in the national narrative, right? That's important because without that, you don't have that national cohesion that is so important. When it comes to a trade-off between a dissolution of state or even a disparate groups unable to work together and like a small band of loyalists who may be antagonized for a small period of time, we are happy to make that trade-off, right? Go on.
But the political nature of an absolute narrative reduces the credibility vis-a-vis an objective historiography. People are going to say this is just political machinery at work.
Yes. So this is exactly what I talked to you about earlier on, right? I told you that when you have a complex narrative that is maybe 100% true, by the way, that complex narrative is harder for people to buy into. It doesn't make for its glorious a story. Then that whole idea initially, that whole idea of disparate groups being linked together, because these disparate groups all can recognize that they had a part to play in the overthrowing of the dictator, that no longer holds true, right? So every disparate group needs to recognize that it had a part to play in the current nation that exists, right? We tell you that the loyalists can integrate themselves into that nation. Right. Now, moving into why this moral nature of this narrative is so important. Right? We tell you it's important because the very nice thing about moral narratives, right, is that they criminalize a certain kind of behavior, not a certain kind of person. What this means is that even if your state is in some degree prejudiced, and this is the worst case scenario, in some degree prejudiced towards a certain group of people, then they will not be able to act, or they cannot be able to act as horribly as that dictator did, right? Why? Because their legitimacy will then be called into question, because the very behavior that they condemn is now the very behavior that they are parroting. Right? This is why their credibility as state is brought into question, right? So they have to keep themselves from engaging in this manner. Think about why, if the United States did not take a principled stance against torture, for example, right? Or rather, it is the reason why the United States use of torture comes under constant criticism and has come underway now is because they have taken a principled stance against it, right? And they have deposed dictators who have engaged in that kind of behavior because people look at that moral hypocrisy that exists and are able to point it out very quickly and then deny you legitimacy for engaging in that hypocrisy. It keeps these people from engaging in the worst excesses of their behavior. That is the perfect environment where we can have a better road for national legitimacy for all the reasons that I give you.
Speaker spoke for 6 minutes and 56 seconds. I thank the leader of the question. Now inviting the Deputy Prime Minister.
The problem with opposition's case line is they fail to analyze the actual dynamics of discourse. Apparently, individuals that consider this dictator as a figurehead, individuals that are loyal to this dictator and understand that he might have some shortcomings but celebrate the things he did right, once the state vilifies these individuals, apparently they're going to follow it, apparently everything's going to be okay. I'm going to extend this debate on 2 levels. Firstly, I'm going to analyze the concept of the deliberative process and how in their model they create the evolution of the theaters of discourse, because we contend that the kind of irrationality that they espouse on their model, that they claim some moral absolutism, that we, the opposition party, are good, and this particular individual is the embodiment of evil, is something that's harmful. But secondly, I'm going to analyze the concept of reformist attitude. Because the problem with this at the House is, they said, we don't want to attach any credit for this particular individual, so we will allow Marcos and all of his infrastructures and all his plans to still be with their system. But wait, then loyalists on their model can still say that Marcos was the one who built these great things. So in terms of creating that narrative that this particular dictator is bad, that we have to always oppose him, but at the same time you retain those policies, we see that's an inconsistency in terms of what exactly do you want individuals to resolve. Before a few levels of rebuttal. Firstly, the laughable argument we got from the opposition is apparently this is important because this portrayal is the source of national identity. Apparently, they can find no other basis of culture and identity aside from the fact that they went against this particular dictator. We say this is false. We say in terms of unity, firstly, there was no analysis, and given that Marian, our Prime Minister, was quite clear that in majority of these societies, it isn't monolithic that everyone is happy that the dictator is gone. Modicums of support exist. In the Philippines, for example, the entire northern region is called the Solid North because they're all Marcos loyalists. We contend that in terms of unity, they don't create unity because we told you that there are many individuals that are loyal. They said, oh, it's okay that they don't access the worst parts of behavior. Guys, they're still citizens. These are still individuals that need representation. These are still individuals that have legitimate ideology. You cannot simply say that just because these individuals did something bad, that everything they did is something that's necessarily something we need to manipulate. But moreover, we told you that in terms of this binding force, again, it's not a mutually exclusive argument. There are many ways to find a source of identity. They needed to qualify why the source of identity was the most important and how that unity is created is okay, given that in democracies, there's still a burden to the majority to accommodate that minority. And we see on their model, they're creating that tyranny. But now we need to rebut this whole, oh, the truth is so hard to buy into. The narrative is so complicated. That's essentially against what democracy stands for in terms of that particular point of discourse. Because here's the thing, they say, oh, individuals will be able to distance themselves. Even if they believe in Marcos's ideology, if you vilify Marcos, nothing's gonna happen. No, guys, they idolize these particular figureheads. They necessarily create a rapport because the majority of dictators have charismatic authority, and this is something that translates through generations. So no, it's not as easy to say that people would buy into it. What's naturally going to occur on their model is it's going to be harder to convince these individuals. It's going to be harder to garner the critical mass. This is the first point of my extension. We need to realize that on their model, what they're doing is they're distorting the truth. Because in our model, it's objective history. We're not going to censor or criminalize individuals that publicly glorify this dictator. We're not going to deny the fact that certain benefits exist. Whereas in their model, because the portrayal that they want is something that's absolutely evil, that's what they're going to do. Why is this harmful? First, in terms of critical mass, again, you reduce a lot of your credibility. A lot of the Marcos loyalists or loyalists of particular dictators are always going to view all of your statements of the state as biased, as politicized, even when it's true. So the problem on their model, because they're so adamant and stubborn on 100% evil, the actual human rights violations that occurred are discredited because of the fact that firstly, it's just political propaganda. Look at this other argument that according to the state, Marcos didn't do this, but Marcos apparently did that. So again, in terms of the state being truthful, it's better to have that standard of truth. So it's not as easy to discredit that because there are certain factual inconsistencies in the state narrative that therefore there is no credibility. But secondly, it's also the concept that on their model, what happens is that when you want to convince someone, basic psyche of discourse is you always want to meet halfway. Because claiming moral absolutism or moral condescension never works. On their model, what happens is when you have the irrationality that this person was always bad, which is a lie, there is no such thing as a 100% bad person. It's met with more irrationality. They become on the defense with their ideology, and this creates that opportunity cost. You create an opportunity cost where people, because they're not willing to listen, we think that the quality of discourse suffers. They need to understand that if you want to convince these individuals, if you want to sway them on their side, you need them to be willing to listen. And they're not going to be willing to listen if they know that every part of ideology that they know is factually true, you are going to discredit simply because of your political agenda.
Sure. Why is it more important to convince the modicum of supporters that these dictators have vis-a-vis the thousands of victims of those dictators and provide them with cohesive message?
Dude, it's about social cohesion. We're not saying that accountability isn't going to occur. We told you quite clearly, individuals that participated in those human rights violations are still going to be atrocious. The problem is some people don't believe the human rights violations because they assume that everything that's being spewed out by the state's mouth is political, it's biased. On our level, on objective historiography, it's more likely that they're going to listen. They can't play the victim card and say, oh, we're the victim because the state is rigged against us. On our level, they realize that there's a standard of truth that somewhat enters the picture. So again, in terms of the deliberative discourse, it's always better. That's why Al Jazeera, for example, one of the most renowned media organizations in the Middle East, interviewed Bin Laden because we were able to assuage his individuals and realize that post-Arab Spring is very important for representation to occur because the negotiation of identity, the negotiation of values that we want can only occur if people are willing to listen and if people feel that they are being swept aside simply because they're not the majority, swept aside simply because they lost the last revolution. So, in conclusion, the deliberative process is much better in our model because one, we are willing to make sure that they're willing to listen, but secondly, in terms of critical mass, we don't antagonize them and we don't appear as biased and uncredible. The second argument is very simple because the biggest temptation of politics is to brand the previous administration as evil. We've seen this with the debate, if you know your Chinese history, between the Sui and the Tang dynasty. You have the reformists and the modernists. It's always the branding that previous ideologies or previous policies are always bad. On their model, if they say that, okay, we're fine with using these irrigation techniques, we're fine with using these frontier policies, then that's a concession that that dictator did something correct, that that dictator did something right. And we say, again, that's not absolutely evil. On their model, the problem on their model, because of this political agenda, that anything related or tainted by this dictator must be removed, you necessarily hinder the progress of society. To use those policy innovations, to have a synthesis of what parts of their ideology, because realize that one particular person or that ideology isn't always evil, we can then, in our model, we create a better political climate. Again, politics isn't about branding the previous individuals as absolutely bad or absolutely evil. It's about balanced discourse and negotiation that cannot happen without objective historiography. Thanks.
The speaker spoke for 7 minutes and 17 seconds. I thank the Deputy Prime Minister. Now calling upon the Deputy Leader of the Opposition.
Two clarifications in this debate. Firstly, what does absolute evil and the narrative of absolute evil actually looks like? I thought Hari was clear, but apparently DPM doesn't understand. Look, our narrative is a recognition that there are benefits and that there are harms that any administration, any government does. But that on a net moral level, that particular government, that particular administration was absolutely evil. That is to say, for example, if you take the example of Nazi Germany, we acknowledge that any government brings some sort of benefits towards its people through the sheer act of governing. That is true. But the very fact, for example, even if you were to argue that Nazi Germany was helpful to the economic expansion of the German people because of the aftermath of the Treaty of Versailles, for example, the very fact that the economic expansion was built on the genocide of 7 million Jews or the continuous waging of wars on thousands of other people from other countries was something that is not morally tenable, Mr. Speaker. This debate is about morality and about what kind of moral standards that we ultimately want to push towards. I think that the comparative of like objective histography that government kind of mentioned but wasn't really clear about was something upon the ideas that these administrations are like can be argued to be morally good on one hand. So for example, it is possible for they have to defend a version of the war, but it is possible and a valid statement for a person, for a neo-Nazi in the status quo, to say that the neo-Nazi regime in 1945 can, for example, be seen as historically good. I think that is the burden that they ultimately have to do so. But moving on, right? Let's move on. What does a post-revolution society actually looks like, and why our argument and Hari's argument about national unity particularly important? Have to understand that a post-revolutionary society lacks a cohesive national identity, even within the groups that were victorious. Because those groups that united together against their dictatorships often get together in an alliance of convenience. I think you need no look further than, for example, the Syrian civil war, for example. Who are the Syrian rebels against Bashar al-Assad? You have one, the al-Nusra Front, Islamic hardliners, for example. Two, for example, you have the Kurdish Peshmerga defending the northeast of Syria, fighting for their land. Three, you have the moderate Syrian rebels, for example, in those same sides. Our contention is this, is that if and when Bashar al-Assad falls, for example, these three disparate groups require some sort of national unity to unite them together. Because they have to understand that in the aftermath of a particular revolution, your nation is not particularly stable. Your nation has the ability to descend once again into civil war. Why? Two reasons. Firstly, we already told you why these disparate groups often lack some entered into alliances of convenience rather than a genuine ideological or ethnic whole among their national identity. But in the aftermath of a revolution, that's when you start to renegotiate, for example, the political landscape. Which group gets what are the spoils of war, for example? Like which group gets to get elected to parliament, how does the constitution look like, so on and so forth. When you're renegotiating the creation of a state, that's when flashpoints of tensions actually occur, and it's possible for your nation to once again descend into civil war, right? We saw this in Mogadishu in 1970, for example, where right after the overthrow of the first dictator, descended into civil war, into the status quo. One. Two, the state is often weak and therefore has no way to impose its will upon these particular people. That's why you have to rely on things as amorphous as narratives to get these people to want to stop fighting instead of the imposition of some sort of force. Why is this characterization particularly important? Because Hari's analysis, notice, was completely contingent upon the fact upon how we have the ability to unite these particular people and unite these outlet is better for this group of people because they have a common narrative that they can get behind. That the narrative of these disparate individuals are automatically joined together in the glorious struggle against an absolutely evil dictatorship. And that struggle itself, for example, against an absolutely terrible regime is something that unites these people. What was the government response to this? They said, one, national identity, you can find alternative sources of national identity, right? That apparently you can talk about different nationalities, ethnicities, or religions. I think they don't understand the context of a post-revolutionary civil war. Notice that a post-revolutionary civil war only occurs when those same aspects of national identity are fundamentally fractured to the point where people start fighting. That's one. But secondly, even the very act of fighting against a disparate national group undermines that national identity themselves. So I don't think that there are any other alternatives by which for them to unite these individuals. And I think that, so that's one. But secondly, I think that the most effective and the most time-sensitive narrative that you can forward to unite these people is the one saying that they were struggling against a dictatorship of absolute evil. It is the time-sensitive question that is extremely important, and the time-sensitive benefit that makes Hari's argumentations absolutely crucial, absolutely ignored by a government. Sure.
Your value of peace doesn't really occur because you're acting as if the modicum of support magically disappears. On your model, you antagonize them and incite more conflict.
No, that's not true for a few reasons. But what even if that's true, right, we're perfectly okay with that, right? Look, okay, so we already told you why this argument was most important. Government's narrative was basically, look, you heard the supporters of the state. For example, the people who supported Marcos, for example, they are denounced. Two reasons. Sure. Firstly, I think that on a trade-off is perfectly okay for two reasons. Why? Notice that we often unite the greater number of people within that particular state. That is to say, for example, dictatorships are often overthrown when a mass majority of the population rise up against that dictators. This is more often true than not. A minority group does not, for example, have the magical ability to take away an entire state most of the reason. Because that dictators often have the ability of one, absolutely control the military and the law enforcement and the ability to impose its will upon the people. So I think on a pure numbers game, when you create the people who fought against that dictators is the majority of the population, and therefore our narrative which unites this majority of the population is one that is most cohesive. On a sheer number games, we win. But two, sure, we acknowledge that we alienate these people to a certain extent. Why are we perfectly okay with that? Because even if that's true, notice that the people who supported the dictators are often the most privileged individuals within that particular elite class. That is to say, for example, the white Afrikaners, even don't know how many decades after the end of apartheid, still enjoy a better socio-economic living than that of the white Africans. So even if we create some sort of harm against nationality towards these people, for example, they are rich and have the ability to insulate themselves from the harms of those particular alienation, right? I think that that's a perfectly willing to trade up. Look, at the end of this day, we acknowledge that national unity is extremely important because it is about the ability to keep your state together and about your ability to be extremely important. Their argument at the end of the day and their last response was like, look, and here's the long term and why we eventually win the long term. Notice that when you continuously push this narrative 10 years down the road, 15 years down the road, it is extremely important for us to recognize that one, even those people who previously supported the government, their children are far more likely to buy into our narrative, and those hyper minority and the people who supported those governments disappear. I think that's one extremely strong advantage why even in the long term we create more cohesive narrative. But a second example is the fact that we create a sense of empowerment towards the people who fought within that war. I think, for example, it's extremely disgusting for them to be able to say that genocides can be justified just because of things like nationality. For all those reasons, proud to oppose.
Speakers for 7 to 19 seconds. Okay, and the leaders of opposition. Here. Now invite you to come with.
Mr. Speaker, from the clarification of the deputy, and I think he thought it was smart, but it's going to be the death of them, he agreed to a fatal concession in this debate, that they don't want moral absolutism, that they don't want to paint the dictator as absolutely evil, because how they're going to evaluate a dictator, even under their model, is based on the actions of the dictator, not the inherent personhood, but the actions. So when he agreed that some infrastructure is good, that some policies were okay, that the foreign policy was somewhat effective, he agreed that sometimes the dictator was good. He's deviating from his burden, and that's why it's going to be the loss of them. Because what he wants then is tempered discussion, tempered moral discussions, one that doesn't fall into the extremes. But their burden was to defend the extremes and how it was effective. That's why we think that when you're branding a dictator as Satan and all of his followers as pawns of Satan's, we see from government side that was unstrategic, because you don't want to build a nation where 200,000 of your people are spawns of Satan's. That really worked really well in Rwanda, and you talk a 100-day genocide that killed all of the Tutsis there. So don't tell me it's effective. Don't tell me that representation has ever been destabilizatory. And that's the first question I'm going to ask in my speech. Is immediate representation after post-revolutionary conflicts actually destabilizatory? And we don't think this is untrue. Well, I'm going to give you several case studies aside from the previous speakers. In Lebanon, they have rebel groups there, the Hezbollah, or even represented in the government. In Northern Ireland, the RA is represented. We gave you examples of Hosni Mubarak. And the reason why Egypt is not an example on your model, but it's actually an example of ours, is the reason why the Muslim Brotherhood immediately got deposed was because the military coup did not see immediate representation of their ideologies there. That's why you see Egypt right now extremely unstable, because they didn't want to reach compromises. Under your model, you evolved the theaters of war. It becomes a competition of whose narrative wins. No, thank you. It does not become a stable democracy, because any democracy that worked in the past realize that some representation is better than no representation, because these are your people too. Often these are ethnically your people. Often these are religiously your people. That's why painting them as spawns of Satan does not make creative discussions that allow for the humanization to occur that will actually make real political discussions happen. That's why we think states can focus on moral absolutism. They can only rely on the theory, but they have to rely on pragmatics, because people will react differently. And these individuals, often in post-revolutionary states, will act against the state as an extension of their right to self-defense. That's why we think that immediate representation is the best way to temper the evolution of warfare, an extension from the deputy that this side of the house never rebutted properly. Why? Because they focus on the small analysis and gave us a hypothetical example of Syria. You know how Syria is going to benefit the most in the future. If you really want to reunite the people, it's to not grab Bashar al-Assad and then grab the Syrian army into the Syrian army. We want to focus on protected discussions for democracy that allows for all uncomfortable information to occur. The right from the leaders of the state to say, well, there is no people want to context, or literally against the essence of democracy. The radical information are how uncomfortable sits that any law wants to encourage it. Start by embracing simple aspirations. Now example one of the limited property response. Toward political transformation, because that is the question of how do we actually allow for states to build themselves after a lot of conflict occurring. We said that the best way to build from destruction is to find compromises. And the problem with moral absolutism is that it's a silencing tool. It is not a listening tool. That's why we say often even portals are created based on identity politics, not based on which policy is best, not based on values that are always up for contestation. And we don't want that to occur. Why? Because obviously, ladies and gentlemen, when you have individuals who have supported their leader, often with people who are willing to sacrifice their lives for the dictator, it's a very sensitive topic. And often, political analysts, no thank you, suggest that in truly allowing them to integrate in society, because we can't sacrifice 200,000 people, obviously, the best way to integrate them is to assume as a state that you are willing to listen. That's why most discourses right now in America always geared towards, I'm potentially incorrect, but I'm also allowing you to see a plethora of arguments that might suggest why I'm right. I would wish to see more explanations as to why German Nazi was completely evil. But I wish to see the other narratives too, because those narratives will then allow us to understand whether or not the metric for confirming that the evil of Adolf Hitler was completely evil can only occur with that kind of objective historiography. That's why we think, in essence, ladies and gentlemen, if the person were completely evil, our model will account for that too. But the process has to occur. Opposition side has to defend why they will bypass that system. Right? And we haven't heard a policy at all except making those narratives happen in textbooks. So their policy essentially has no teeth. It's branding them as absolutely evil, but just for the sake of it, not in full politics. And we think that's the reason why they're going to lose in second issue. Yes?
We did you the courtesy of taking both cases at their very best. So sure, yes, we will alienate these groups of people. But why is it more important to value the supporters of a fallen dictator versus uniting the disparate group that fought against?
Yeah, okay, so then it leads me to ask, why is it that for the people who have suffered under-education, it's okay? Because what we provided from the government side was still a solution for a trial to occur. What opposition has to answer was like, why was it that the solution was insufficient, right? Because the extent of our solution already existed. A trial is going to happen. This person is likely to go to jail. We're probably going to pay reparations to these communities. That can happen even under our model without having to concede that we are against absolute evil. Meaning, ladies and gentlemen, if it's about the people who have won, we really don't understand where they're going to be extremely unsatisfied already. Because what state do you create? You create a state that is an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. Any stable democracy in status quo, from the European Union to Central America, have abandoned this kind of mentality. Because to build a constitution out of blood and death is not a good way of creating a constitution that stands for human rights. Which leads me to the point that I can close on. At the very best, we accept. Under our model, some people will be disappointed. But what will they do? Because the essence of democracy is if you're disappointed, you are able to tell this person, well, you're wrong. And that's the point. We don't want silencing to ever happen. Because the moment that happens, you push people into a corner and you start evolving and become violent. To temper that, moral absolutism should be abandoned. We're happy to propose.
Speakers to go for 13 seconds. I think now inviting the opposition speakers.
Even if we take the worst case on our side, right, which is the only thing that opposition wants to engage with, we think at the worst point, we think silence can sometimes be justified if the actions that are silenced are extremely abhorrent. These are things like, for example, using the Nazi salute, which is bad. Things like, for example, having neo-Nazi parties are things which are bad. The reason why these things are bad and the reason why this aligns with our stance is that because we recognize that at the end of the day, when you compare individuals or when you compare dictators or regardless of their personhood or regardless of their actions, we think we can objectively assess that if they were so abhorrently evil to a point where we cannot allow for any discourse of that type of stance to happen, we are morally justified in terms of silencing that sort of discourse if it brings better social reintegration. This is a line that is coming down from outside the house, but yet they only wanted to engage the worst excesses of our side, right? They never really got to the middle ground that we were willing to engage them with. Two things I'm going to be talking about in my speech. Number one, on the idea of social reintegration, and secondly, on the trade-offs of losers of revolution. Because essentially, government never wanted to make any sort of trade-offs throughout all three speeches. First thing, social integration. What did they tell us? They told us that for example, objective portrayals are extremely important because if we don't do those things on our side, the portrayal is extremely political. Right? This is where we talk about how there's propagating pieces will happen by the new administration, and that's something that harms social reintegration. But we think, right, the characterization of this harm on their side is not mutually exclusive, right? The harm that they talk about. If we buy their characterization, then the new government, for example, is so inherently against the overthrown dictators, things are going to become political and propagandic anyway, right, on both sides of the house. If we truly assume that the intentions of the new leaders in power was that they hate the previous leaders so bad, even on their side, when you assume some sort of objective portrayal, we think it's more likely to lean towards the side that they won the war, right? I.e., history will still be decided by the victors who won the war. So on their side of the house, we think things are still likely to get political. But let's then assume that they tell us the response to this is that, oh, but things will be more political on our side versus your side. If we assume that this is true, right? Why then here's why it's so important. Here's the analysis of things. For post-revolutionary societies, we think you require simple and powerful narratives that can tie in disparate groups together. This is analysis that Hari brought to you, right? They rejected this by saying that simplistic narratives are not effective enough, right? And you need some sort of complex narrative. We don't think so. We think, especially in post-revolutionary societies, we think the importance of what people want at that point in time, some sort of stability and some sort of guaranteed chance of survival. Because these things are extremely chaotic in nature, right? The society is extremely divided, society is extremely chaotic. The only way for you to gather disparate groups, right, to come together and achieve some sort of united post-revolutionary society is at the point in time where we are able to achieve a simplistic version by showing that the previous overthrown dictator was abhorrently evil. That's at the point in time where all the disparate groups were the common enemy, i.e. someone like Hosni Mubarak can group up together in this post-revolutionary society and pursue some form of sustained peace and development, right? That is why simplistic narratives, while they may be simplistic, are extremely important. They never give any analysis on their side what complex narratives are important, beyond just saying that you need complex narratives and simplistic narratives won't work. We effectively proved to you for all three speakers why this is absolutely important. The second big idea that he had, right, towards this was the idea of like loyalists, right? So let's move on to the second issue, right, which is much larger. What are the trade-offs that both sides are making, and what is the post-revolution necessarily going to look like? So let's deal with this whole loyalist argument, right? Because it became a huge thing in this debate. They told us, for example, that even if you have our narrative that the dictator like Marcos was absolutely evil, that loyalists will still respect him, right? And it's harder to change their mind. The problem here with this kind of line of logic here is this. If they recognize that loyalists still exist on both sides, right, and you have an objective portrayal, for example, it means that on their side, loyalists still have legitimacy and credibility.
Why is this particularly bad and exclusive harm on their side of the house? Because that undercuts government's own case or own aims of social reintegration, because they never prove the link between objective portrayals and what their prime minister said the first second of the speech about social reintegration. Which then brings on the next question, right? Which narrative will loyalists better believe, right, in terms of social reintegration, if you really want to engage with that? We think an objective narrative is far worse because it is a wash at the end of the day, right? We think loyalists, for example, on their side, will continue to believe that the dictator was right, and that the victims, on the other hand, would never respect these individuals. That's when you allow loyalists, for example, to destabilize the new government by throwing false news or assertions. That's when things become far more political on their side of the house, because people who supported Marcos are still given legitimacy on their side of the house, right? When their objective portrayals say that, oh, Marcos wasn't such a bad guy. After all, that is when loyalists continue to gain legitimacy even after the new government has overthrown. On the comparative, right, when you portray dictators as absolutely evil, we think we first benefit, number one, because it's a singular narrative. So even if this benefit may be small, it's still an exclusive benefit on their side. Secondly, here's why loyalists can listen much more better on the outside. When you are the loser of a revolution, for example, your first priority oftentimes is survival and safety, which is prioritized over your support for the overthrown dictator. You are likely to switch your allegiances because that is the most beneficial. It is more beneficial for you to forget about your loyalty to Marcos if that means you are able to survive in a post-revolutionary society. That is why we think of their worst case, right? Because loyalists won't change on both sides of the house, we think at least we get the loyalists, for example, who are susceptible to change, or the loyalists who can change allegiances to change their mind and support this. On both sides, we see that the hardline loyalists will never change their mind. That's a wash. But we are telling you, if we accept the middle ground from both sides, we think if you think some loyalists can be changed, we think it's far better. But on both sides where hardcore loyalists exist, we think the harm is further perpetuated on their side, where hardcore loyalists still have legitimacy in political sense and still legitimacy in a social sense. Yes.
Are you honestly arguing that the simple narrative that we have a common enemy will allow three groups with different ideologies and ethnicities to necessarily settle aside their differences and cooperate regardless?
Yes, because Hari and Juping told you that this narrative cohesion is not based on ethnic lines or based on principles of morality, which can be identified by everyone regardless of who you identify with. This is where the further harm of their side comes in, right? Because they never put up what kind of representation they wanted. They just said the narrative can be social or ethnic. But we already told you why social and ethnic narratives are extremely harmful, right? Because that is when siege mentality exists. That's when we in the new government, for example, which is Sunni, pits itself against the Shia individuals, for example, in both states, for example. That's when narratives along social and ethnic lines don't work on their side. On our side, a simplistic narrative that prioritizes moral absolutism is much more easier for people and individuals on the ground to believe. Lastly, they did an extreme strawman of our case, right? They said that, oh, we don't want some sort of, that apparently we didn't want some sort of moral absolutism. That's not true. Hari mentioned that we should not romanticize dictators, but that on the whole, that they are absolutely abhorrent. Juping said that you may know that they did good things, but are still particularly terrible. This still applies to the principle of moral absolutism, because you still consider the whole of the individual and concluding that he is someone that we do not want to see in our textbooks. But even if you see dictators as a spawn of Satan, here's why it's better. Because we think it's far more important to account for the protection of majorities that Juping talked to you about in speech. If we can get more people to accept social reintegration, we can get more people to buy into the narrative, we think are more likely better to make that trade-off. They never wanted to make that trade-off because they assume that everyone on their side benefits. For all of those reasons, very, very proud to oppose.
The speaker spoke for 7 minutes and 20 seconds. I thank the opposition speaker. Now, close the opposition bench. Opposition replies.
I think for the Syrian Kurds, I think for the Al-Nusra Front, I think for the moderate Syrian rebel and the Free Syrian Army, literally the only thing that unites them is the struggle. It's the struggle against a dictatorship that has imposed and stripped them of their freedoms for generations to come. It is against a dictatorship that has continuously oppressed not just them, their children if it was allowed to survive, their parents and their grandparents, and generations of those Syrians. I think, Mr. Speaker, the reality of this situation is this, is that in this status quo, post-revolutionary societies are not pretty. That even if you fight against a dictatorship, that fragile peace that you have, and make no mistake, is extremely fragile for the thousands of reasons we gave you. One, the lack of stable state institutions, or two, the absence of, for example, a national narrative means that it is extremely important for you to create and give them some sort of narrative to unite this particular group of people. We acknowledge that, yes, towards the end of the day, we're absolutely willing to say that, yes, there were trade-offs involved. There are harms which they spend the entirety of their speech proving was basically that supporters of the dictators will be alienated. Yes, we acknowledge that this may be true, but even if that is so, this debate ultimately swung into a evaluation of the importance of groups. Supporters of the dictators vis-a-vis the rest of the population who supported the revolution. We gave you 4 reasons why the latter was most important. 1, we told you that the time-sensitive nature of the situation requires, requires a quick and powerful narrative in order to stop this. That's why Surah explained, for example, towards that POI, for example, that a common narrative, a common enemy is ultimately extremely important. But even if we say that she's somewhat more effective, notice on the comparative that they never actually gave a counter model and said why their counter model was inherently better. Their only response was twofold, right? 1, basically this random, like objective histography or court system, some sort of random TRC that might actually occur. Notice, panel, that we already told you that in Hari, for example, that 1, those court systems often take a huge amount of time, and 2, are often administered by the victors of their administration, and those kind of histories are never objective anyway, for example. But 2, we told you that it was like, so that's 1, and that's how we ensure that those people are important. But 2, we also told you that on a sheer number scale, our narrative is more appealing towards the greater part of that population. That is to say, for example, towards any particular, in any revolution against a dictator, it only is successful when a critical mass of that population rises up to overthrow that particular, for example, that particular dictator and be achieved. I think, for example, that this information and this analysis was crucial because it also shows that our narrative, insofar as it attracts the back row of people, was most effective towards those people. 3, we told you that sure, even if we were to accept their harms, 10, 15 years down the road, I think that those modicum of supporters will change their mind because those children will grow up in a world where they were never ultimately infringe upon, they never benefited from that dictatorship, and therefore their perception of identity towards that dictator is not as strong. 4, we also told you at the end of the day, for example, even if all this is true, the people who are alienated are unfortunately the most privileged individuals within that particular oppressed society. Then, for example, the Alawites in Syria, for example, benefited hugely from the Bashar al-Assad regime and therefore are most well equipped to protect themselves against the harms of our population, comparative towards the people on our side, which are poor minorities who had to rebel because they often had no other choice. I think at the end of this debate, Mr. Speaker, is about the ability for both sides to comparatively weigh out the importance of the groups that they were fighting for. Insofar as we're the only group, for example, who talked about those groups of debate and why that was most important, proud to oppose.
It was 3 minutes and 51 seconds. I think opposition match. Now the last speaker of the debate, Governor.
There are 3 reasons why this side of the House clearly loses the debate. Firstly, realize that the primary defense of the counterfactual demotion was it was a tool of convenience, that in a post-revolutionary society, we need to be able to have a source of identity, and the best way to create that identity and unity is to diametrically oppose. Realize that when opposition kept on mentioning how simplistic the case was, realize it was because their logic is, because we have a common enemy, because we can say an absolute evil, therefore peace will occur, therefore we will be able to hold hands and cooperate. No, we tell you that this side of the House never qualified. Just because you have a qualification of absolute evil, how will you have a qualification of absolute good? How will these individuals with different political ideologies be able to cooperate? They said, oh, in certain context-specific areas like Syria, it worked. What about the cases like Lebanon? What about the cases like Yugoslavia? Where because different parties were still acting for power, despite the fact that they all hated the ruling party, how are they necessarily going to create this unity? But realize, guys, social cohesion, social society, these members of minorities are also important. So for this side of the House to simply brush them aside removes that concept of social cohesion. But this is the funny part, right? Because they say that's what's going to unite us all. Because these 3 parties are going to directly oppose that we hate this dictator, we think he's absolutely evil. But at the same time, we're going to incorporate the benefits and good elements of his policy, the benefits and good elements of his ideology into our system. So I have a question. Why would those be flashpoints of tension? Why would that create some kind of cognitive dissonance or tension? We don't understand how on their model they say it's simple, but at the same time they went to soft stats and said, oh, if there are benefits, we'll go up that. Realize that that wasn't the narrative they needed to use in this debate. Realize that they were trying to skip their verdict. But the second reason why they're going to lose is they became desperate and they tried to make this comparative. If you side with Gov, you are literally spitting on the victims. No, guys, we told you in terms of accountability that accountability will still occur. Remember, even in an objective historiography, if they did commit human rights violations, then they're still going to be prosecuted. It's not going to side with them. What we're talking about is, on our model, we still give those victims justice, but what we want is to be able to make sure that we don't antagonize these loyalists, because we want these loyalists to realize, and for a compromise, recognize that human rights violations actually occurred. My extension was about critical mass, and how you will never create the willingness to listen. You will never create the willingness for loyalists to agree that certain parts did occur if all we're going to see is political propaganda. Because this is what was confusing, because opposition web argued as an objective is on their model. No, on your model it's political. On your model you're distorting. In fact, Alan said the truth is too hard to buy into. So again, if it's about the victims, we've got them covered. But what the victims really want is somewhat societal recognition that these atrocities occur. And we think that compromise is only going to happen when you talk to these individuals, when you create that middle ground and not antagonize them. But the second reason why they're going to lose is they literally have a very context-specific rebuttal to the concept of democracy. We told you from my speech that in terms of the tyranny of majority, democracies have an obligation to accommodate. They say, oh, it's a really small part. We say, no, this multi-government support is very important. You can't just define that they're rich and that they're going to be vulnerable. You can't just say that it's easy to brush them aside. On their model, they become the dictator because they're saying that these individuals, regardless if they are citizens, do not deserve a part in their society. Are they second-class citizens? That's the implied argumentation from opposition reply. We say that at the end of the day, if it's really about social cohesion, if it's really about representation, we were very frank in terms of moral absolutism is something that cannot be principally defended, but moreover, we told you that in terms of the harms that are created under model, you don't create a level of social cohesion because you still alienate these individuals. The last reason why they're going to lose is the desperate tactic was to burden push us, that apparently we have to solve and unite the world. No, guys, obviously what we told you is that in terms of your model, this tool of unity is one, a low level of unity that is unsustainable, but two, incites more violence and incites more inflammatory discourse. We don't side against the victims. We side with the truth because we think that's more important vis-a-vis the political nature of their model that's principally incorrect, but moreover pragmatically simplistic. Thanks.
Sorry. I think all the debaters in the room, you guys, may cross the floor. Thank you.
Thank you.